My name is Joselyn Tavares, and I'm the director of the Swansea Library, and I'd like to welcome you to our first episode of Flipping the Pages. And I am thrilled to introduce Steve Manchester,
Thank
who
you,
I know a
Jocelyn.
lot of you already know.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I truly am. Thank you so much for the invitation.
We're so thrilled to have you.
Wonderful.
So tell us first how you got started with writing and...
Yeah, so when I was a kid, my grandfather was an amazing storyteller, right? And he was an old swamp Yankee from Westport. And I'll make this quick, but he planted a seed in me when I was very young. He was like a master storyteller. He could make you laugh, make you cry. I couldn't tell what was fact, what was fiction, and it didn't matter. He just, he taught me that words connect people. Fast forward 20 years, I'm in the first Gulf War. My call sign is Swamp Yankee, right, as an homage to my grandfather, a little wink. And it was a difficult time, really difficult time. But my dream had been to become a published author or, this master storyteller that he was. He never put pen to paper, but I wanted to, The problem is the rejection rate is 97%, right? So when you commit to start writing and try to do it professionally, you're in for a ride, right? So I end up flipping a Humvee. I'm stranded for 3 hours in the desert. Before the chopper comes in and takes me away, I make a promise to myself, not if, but when I get home, I'm going to chase down my dream and become a published author, because life's too short and there's no guarantee, right? So I would rather fail at something that I love than to succeed at something that I hate. And I was in law enforcement at the time, working in the prison system and doing well, but the negativity was brutal. So it just, long story short, if it's not too late, Jocelyn, but I'll tell you, one of the most traumatic events of my life ended up becoming a crossroad that changed my life and for the better. So I'm grateful for that.
That's great. So can you tell us about your very first book that you published?
Yeah, so I ended up using a pen named Stephen Herbert's, which was one of the smartest things I did because I didn't know how to write, right? And the book was absolutely awful. So it took me 3 years to get it published. It was called 6'5", A Different Shade of Blue, and it was essentially a walk through, adult prison system through the eyes of a correction officer. And the book did well within the industry. But what happened is I put out 2 or 3 books under this pen name, and I was able to buy time to actually learn my craft and start to get my voice. And when I teach younger writers, what I tell them is, I didn't really even know what my voice was until I was 15, 20 years into the business, right? Where you have to just keep working. There's no perfection, it's all practice. But so fortunately today, I'm not even sure I could plagiarize anything because I have such a distinct voice and the way that I tell my stories. But it's a long road, it's a hard road, but I cannot imagine a life better spent for me, to take that on.
Right. And how many books have you written?
I've written over 30. I have 7 national bestsellers, 4 went to #1. One of them, The Thursday Night Club, became an audio podcast drama with Kathleen Turner. We ended up recording that in Brooklyn. Did so well because it was kind of episodic, and you can download it for free on Apple Podcasts. And all of a sudden, this production company out of North Carolina was interested in doing the film. We ended up doing the film in Torrington, Connecticut. Gloria Gaynor, the disco star. So she did survive, and she's on the movie as the doctor. And it was just an amazing experience because I was able to share it with my daughter Bella, who sings on the opening track and the closing track, and she also appears in the film.
Oh, that's great.
Which is, and she came here. She came to Case High School for, and studied under Neil Geronimo, and just, we're very, very grateful. I love this town and the connections to it.
I know you've done a few other things with him and with Case particularly.
Yeah, we ended up, he honored me by asking several years ago to do an original play. It was called The New Everyman, and we ended up putting that up. Ended up going to States, so they did really, really well with it. A couple years ago, we ended up doing The Desecrated Temple. It was basically the story of Medusa. Also did incredibly well. So the kids in this school are just, the talent is through the roof. I go see college, performances that pale in comparison to what they're putting up here. So just to be involved in that, it was just so much fun. It wasn't for me about winning anything. It was really about collaborating with young people that are creative and just watching, my vision come to life. And then, I take it, it's 2-dimensional. Neil takes it, all of a sudden, pop, right? It's amazing, and it's fantastic.
That's great.
Yeah.
I know you've also worked with other young people, specifically bringing awareness to autism.
I have, yeah. So there's a young gentleman in town that lives in town, Chase Howard, and I'm, good friends with the Howard family. And one day we were, poolside and talking about my next project, and I see him and he's drawing, and I said, well, someday you and Uncle Steve are going to write a book together, and everybody laughs. And about 18 months later, we ended up putting out Perfect Chase, One Reflection of Autism. And I have to tell you, Joselyn, like, we've sold some copies, but we've given away hundreds of copies, and it's going out to schools, and it's just so awesome to have told the story through this family's perspective, where it's not about the medicinal side of autism, it's about, their story and what it's like to, and it's amazing. It taught me so much, and Chase did the illustrations, which is the highlight in the book.
Right.
So again, I was honored to be a part of that with him.
Do you have a favorite book that you've worked on?
It's always the one I'm working on because I love the creative process. Yeah. I was commissioned from a gentleman in Alabama, believe it or not. I flew down there and we ended up doing a book called You Will Be Peter. So it's with the agent right now, and it's the 3.5-year evolution of St. Peter going from fisherman to the founder of the Christian church, right? And I didn't attack it, or we didn't tackle it from a religious perspective, which is kind of tough to take, but it was more about a biography. It's about, basically being there on the ground, and Jesus says this, and he turns to his brother Andrew, and it's putting you in the scene, making it more, more relatable and approachable. So it took 18 months. I had to study antiquated maps,
right.
Break the Gospels down and put it in linear order so the timeline's correct. So that's probably one of my favorites, only because of the time spent, and I think the potential impact is going to be enormous. So.
When should we expect to see that?
I'm really thinking that the book will be published by the end of the year. So my guess is it'll come out, next year. It's really on the heels of The Chosen, which is being done by Dallas Jenkins. I mean, they've just surpassed 600 million viewers, right? So people are hungry for, for the word, but in a way that's approachable. That's, I can put myself in the scene. So
Got it.
It was an honor to do that too. And it's such, the guy's name is Jerry Lathan, and we hit it off so well. I went down there and all of a sudden, we're storyboarding this, and I knew this was going to be an enormous undertaking, right? And I kind of anguished over it, because who am I to write about a biblical character? But in the end, I think he picked the right person, because it's so emotionally, it just hits home, and it's a beautiful story. So it's a retelling of that, through the character's eyes.
Very interesting. I like those different alternate view
Right,
books.
absolutely.
I love that.
Yeah, I do as well.
And you mentioned storyboarding. Can you talk about that process and what that is?
Yeah, so years ago, it used to take me 2 to 3 years to write a book, right? And I ended up meeting a gentleman out of Stamford, Connecticut, who ends up becoming my publisher, or one of my publishers, Lou Aronica, and he taught me the art of storyboarding. And essentially, it's creating an outline while still having some creative, freedom within the outline. So today, I'll put out a book, between 6 to 9 months, I'll finish a full-length novel, because if you and I sat down and, say all of us in this room had dinner together and we started talking about, and started fleshing out the book, I said, these are the characters, this is the plot point, this is the setting. The more that I can see it before I get into it, the quicker the writing becomes. So you spend more time up front, kind of, it's me.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm trying to create limitations or restrictions for myself, but once you have that outline and I can follow the outline, I have the freedom to just hammer away, right? So it's fantastic. And it took me a long time to be able to master that. And now I'm a huge advocate. Years ago, I was considered the kitchen sink, right? So I would throw everything at the book, and then we'd go into editing and spend a ton of time. Now I'm a lot more precise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. And how, you said this book took you 18 months. Is that the typical
research
time?
The research was probably a year of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I had to, study film, and there were two, if you look at the Bible, there were two, there are biblical scholars and theologians that are masters of what Paul said, right? So St. Paul, a lot less with Peter, but Peter is not as prevalent as far as his writings within the Bible, so you really have to stretch it out there and kind of, but I loved it, because you're basically on the ground in Jerusalem walking around 2,000 years ago. And the research, Joselyn, was, how do they brush their teeth? What do they eat? What were the sandals made of? The clothing, political context, so the Pharisees, versus the Romans, the whole thing. So, and I could go on forever, but it was, and I loved it. And I was able to flex my muscle a little bit as far as the research went, learn a little bit more. It's important to continue to challenge yourself, right? I've been doing this for 30 years, and it's never easy. It's always a bit of a surprise when I finish a book, and I've been at it for so long, and I pump them out. But I think if it wasn't this challenging, I wouldn't be doing it.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
That is important for all of us to take with us to our
Absolutely.
regular lives.
And the main thing, I tell writers all the time, do not, or any industry, right? Don't compete with other people, right? Compete with yourself. Just whatever you put out, make sure the next thing you put out is a little bit better, right? And you just work toward that, right? But for me, I'm known for writing emotionally charged, reality-based fiction. So tearjerkers. 85% of my readership are female. I mean, I'll walk into a room, and a couple of years ago I was a keynote speaker, and I walked in, there's maybe 250 people in the room, me and two other guys. One is holding his wife's pocketbook, the other one looks lost, right? So I sit in the back, I turned to the lady, I said, have you ever heard this gentleman speak? And I'm the keynote, right? And she has no idea who I am. She's read my stuff, but doesn't,
Yeah.
So she says, I haven't. So I said, well, he's absolutely terrible. I think we wasted our time, our money and our time. Turns to her friend, oh my God, I hope the lunch is good, the whole thing. And then they announce me, I get up to the podium, I turn back, I look at her, she starts laughing, I stop. But I'm 6 feet tall, right? I weigh 250, like I'm not. So all my readership for the most part, right, it's almost anonymous, right? So I write these books, people don't know who I am. And then all of a sudden they look at me and I don't present like I'm the guy writing tearjerkers, right? So it's fun.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Are you working on anything right now?
I am. So I'm working with the production company that put out the Thursday Night Club, the film, which you can get for free. It's streaming everywhere. Ended up contacting me. They wanted to do a book based on my 80s series, right? So Lawn Darts and Lemonade, Bread Bags and Bullies. The problem with doing independent films right now is the COVID protocols are difficult, right? So they put a halt to it. Said, hey, why don't we do a book together? And your co-author will be Eric Estrada, right? Who was Poncherelli on Chips. And I grew up loving this, right? So I'm like, of course. So I meet him in Torrington. He's a gentleman. And we're writing a book right now on MS, where the protagonist or the main character has multiple sclerosis. And it's really targeted toward a younger audience. So it's so cool to be able to do all the research, learn about the disease, and then tell it in story form, right, through his family's eyes. Almost, to be honest, it's inspired by the Perfect Chase book.
Oh, that's, wow.
Almost
that's
the
fantastic.
same format. So, yeah, it's cool how things connect, and you don't realize it at the time, But so we have that going. I just finished the sequel to The Menu. It's called The Ledger. It takes place in the prison system in the mid-'90s. So that's probably going to sit for about a year. I need the editor, and so I convene a beta team. So we have proofreaders, the whole thing. I have 2 copy editors, and it takes a while to go through it. It's meticulous.
Can you talk about that process for us?
Yeah, so I'll write a book. I edit the book 3 times. I then take the manuscript, I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I try to leave it for 2 to 3 months. I come back to it. It's the last time I'm really able to see it, right? And because there could be holes. I could have a character, Helen could be in the book in chapter 2, and then all of a sudden Helen reappears in chapter 12, and you're like, what happened to Helen, right? But in my head, Helen's there the whole time, right? So that's the problem with writing. Like, everything's in my head. So when you read something, you don't know what was chopped on the editing floor, the whole thing, right? The last time that I do the editing, it goes off to the copy editor. She finishes it. She's fantastic. She's from the Midwest. She's in an RV. Her and her husband travel, right? They're semi-retired. And she has a keen eye, right? And the thing with editing is this, right? There's only one question. Whatever suggestion I make, does it make the book better or does it make it different? And I don't want to hear about different. I want to hear about better, right? So I wrote it for a reason. But if we can enhance it, then we do that. Once the copy edit is done, I'll convene a beta team, 10, 12 people, give them a month to read it. Then we get together. I'll cater it. It's a lot of fun. We'll lock people in a room for 3 hours. And then I ask very specific questions, and then I'm able to finish the book. And at that point, I'm out looking for endorsements from, New York Times bestsellers or actors or whatever, because it helps to sell the book once it's released. Yeah.
So tell us about that process.
Yeah, so, I'll give you the 80s series. My dad passed 5 years ago, and I was blessed enough to be there holding his hand when he did. And I remember walking out of the ICU thinking, I'm going to write this man a book, right? Because I can't just give him a thank you letter for everything he's given. I am who I am because of him. So I'm going to write a book, and I love the 80s. And, we're going to do it about a family in, southeastern New England. And I write the book. It takes me about 6 or 7 months to write the book. And then I decide, I'm going to go after endorsements, but instead of the normal fare that I go after, I'm going to go after 80s icons. And I went after 400 of them, and I ended up landing 60 of them.
Wow.
Everybody from Jamie Farr, from MASH, who played Klinger, to Greg Brady, to some of the one-hit wonders from so it was so much fun. And then I had never written a sequel. I decided the book or the story needs a little more real estate, so I'm going to write Lawn Darts and Lemonade. So picture the first one, winter of 1984, Westport, Fall River. And then all of a sudden, fast forward to the summer, so I'm able to open the doors and get these 3 maniac kids out of the house. And then I went after more endorsements, and it was just a blast. And the reason I got a kick out of it is my father wouldn't have cared about a New York Times bestselling author. But if I said to him, listen, Ed Asner, right, who played Santa Claus on Elf and all these other things, he read the book, loved the book, blurbed it, endorsed it. My father would have got a huge kick out of it. So it was fun. It's like going fishing, right? I'll throw a bunch of bobbers in the water and we'll see what goes under.
That's great.
Yeah.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
It is.
And to get 60 responses
a lot more than we
just
need. Yeah, a lot more than we need.
amazing.
Yeah.
So
And what happens is when you have people like Taylor Dane or Corey Hart who have such enormous followings, when they mention the book, so all of a sudden, they were, George Austin out of Somerset, very good friend of mine, and George goes on, the annual 80s cruises, right? So these people get dressed, they have a prom, they have a graduation. It's amazing how you're able to relive the 80s, but there is an 80s following that's almost fanatical, right? So he and I, he's helped me with the books as well, and he gets such a huge kick out of it because it's an easy ride. We've lived it, right? So you just kind of capture it, and people who are younger have no idea, right? What it was like not to have a cell phone, or we were out coming in the house before the streetlights went on.
The remote attached to the TV.
Exactly. Yeah, MTV comes out, all of a sudden the world opens up, right? And then I'm with my magic 8-ball shaking it, trying to make all my major decisions based on those answers. So a lot of fun. That
is great. Is there a question you wish people asked you but don't?
That is a great question. I've done a lot of interviews.
Yeah,
I've never been asked that question. More about the process. So when people come to me and they'll say, and I know this is a general answer, but hey, I love the book. I appreciate that. Hey, this book meant this to me. I appreciate that. Rather than talking about the end product, if people ask about the process, that's an opening for me to share my world, right? And we talked about it before we came on camera. This is a very neurotic life. I spend a lot of time in my head with characters, making them come to life, and then I I finish a book, I take my wife out for dinner, I apologize to her because, I'm only half listening as I'm writing this book, and so the process, like whenever somebody asks me about the process, I'll literally take a seat and then we'll get into a conversation. It's a much, much different talk. And it doesn't have to just be writing. Like I think, when I work with young people, I tell them, listen, I don't care if you sing, dance, if you're on the stage, right, or you're writing poetry, or you never get anything published, keep that side of your brain open, right? Make sure you don't lose that 8-year-old. I mean, people look at me and I'm 8 years old. Like when I sit down, everything that I imagine is absolute truth for me. So when people read my work, they think, oh my God, you know what I mean? Like this actually happened. It did in my head. I made it up, but you know what I mean? Awesome. The 8-year-old in me believes it's true, so.
So how do you develop your characters? How are they born?
They have to be real to me. So the reason I've been as successful as I have is because I developed characters long before the book is written. And I can tell you, and I'll give you an example. I wrote a book called The Rocking Chair, which takes place at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains of Montana. And I have the protagonist, his name's Grandpa John in the book, right? I developed him so much in my head that as I'm writing, the dialogue starts to drop. And rather than him yelling at his grandchild, he just raises an eyebrow and kind of leans in. So you as the reader can feel that, oh my God. The trick with characters is you only write 80% of them. So if I'm writing about Grandpa John, I'm going to presume that most of my readers have had a grandparent. So if I give you 100%, all 5 senses, this is what he smells like, what he looks like, what his voice sounds like. He doesn't smoke, but he's got a gruff voice. He probably did smoke at one point. I develop all that stuff, and then I take a little bit of it away. Because if all of a sudden becomes your grandfather or your grandmother, oh my God. The characters have been more than endeared to you. Now you're in the story.
Right.
And really my job is to make people escape. I write fiction. So nonfiction, you're out to learn, right? Fiction, I don't want to think about the bills for a couple of days, right? Let me escape to a place. So for me, the way to escape it is to develop the characters so much, and I know this is a cliche, but the characters will essentially tell that story for you.
Yeah, no, that makes
It's like if we all went out to a movie tonight and you walked out, we could all sit in the theater and look at each other and say, this is going to happen next. because this is the way that I would write it, because the characters have been so well developed that you know how they're going to act, react, what they're going to say. That's the trick to the game.
Do you have a favorite character in all your...
Yeah, so Grandpa John would be one of them because he's my grandfather. That's a
Yeah.
big wink, right? I wrote a book called Goodnight Brian. In the book, there's a woman called Mama, and she has a grandchild who's born, and he's lactose intolerant. I'll try to be quick with this, but basically he rejects, his mother's milk. They put him on a formula. He rejects that. They get him on a soy-based formula, and this is based on a true story. In the late 70s, they had removed some of the sodium, one of the companies did. So it's essentially fried the front of his brain, right? So before it's over, they bring the baby to Boston. He's never going to walk. He's never going to talk, ride a bike. He's never going to swim. That's it. And the grandmother, who's about 4'9", steps up and tells the doctor, "You're full of it." And she devotes the rest of her life to this kid. And I write love stories, right? But it's not just between a man and a woman. A love story could be between a grandmother and a grandson. Yeah. And for me, how do you write a love story, an unconditional love story? When you're with your spouse or you're with a partner, they can do something that could break that relationship, right? Unconditional love is found in other places, right? And I'm not saying it doesn't exist between a man and a woman or
right.
Two women, two men, partners, whatever. But for me, it was such an easier right to say, here's this beautiful soul who all of a sudden devotes the rest of her life to her grandson. And the love he gives back to her is absolutely tremendous. So,
you've given a bit of advice to us through your stories. Is there a piece of advice that was given to you that you've taken?
Yeah, another great question. So the underlying thread for all of my work, and picture in 1991, I flip a Humvee, right? I'm stranded for 3 hours. And I actually used it in this book, but you were never alone, not ever. If every book that you read, if you feel like, oh my God, that applies to me or I can relate to it, it's because you are never alone, not ever. I need you, me being the writer, I need you to understand that you're not alone. And that's the gift that I want to give.
Is there a piece of advice that you wish someone gave you before you started?
Yeah, I'll be okay.
That's
I'll be
great.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're going to be okay. And that applies to everybody, right? I could say, if I talk to young writers, I tell them never quit, right? You have to expect, and it goes on and on and on and on. But it's that, and I can't take credit for this, but I love that saying where somebody says, "I hate to spoil the ending for you, but you're going to be okay."
In our last few minutes,
sure.
Is there something you want to plug coming up?
So I think we're going to be starting a podcast based on the menu.
Cool.
So of all the books that I've written, I think this has had the most impact. Hospice throughout New England has adopted the book. I've been the keynote speaker at several different events. And the menu I wrote for my children to kind of quell their fears of death, right? So what I love about this book is there are characters in the book that die and remain in the book. Heaven is a very real place. God has a great sense of humor. Not religious. I'm not even trying to sell any of my faith, but almost like, it's kind of scary, right? But here's me telling my kids, you don't worry about it coming here. Don't worry about leaving. My father passed, my mother recently passed. I'm in the room with them. For me, it's a vapor, right? I have so much faith that I believe, not only do I believe I'm going to see them again, I believe that they're still with me. They might even be in this room, right? So that's my faith. I'm never alone because my faith doesn't allow for it.
That's great. And where can we find your books? I know you mentioned your movie streaming.
Yeah, so Amazon is probably the best place. So it's at Barnes & Noble, Apple, you can get it everywhere. But Amazon's probably the easiest and the cheapest for my readers. Everything's in ebook format or print. And I think I have 6 or 7 books in audio as well. So
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you for joining us today. And it's been such a pleasure.
The pleasure's been mine, and I'm honored to be the first on this show. I truly am. Thank you for that.
No, thank you. And thank you all for watching with us. And we hope to see you on another episode of Flipping the Pages.